So this somewhat relates to the previous video I made about pranks. It's a similar sort of context and it's a similar angle in a sense that I'm taking with this. So I've just been watching a countdown video of WatchMojo.com, and they had a countdown of times that comedians went too far in their view. Of course, this is all subjective. It's all down to opinion. But it got me thinking about this issue that we have in Western culture over what is funny and what is not. And I say in Western culture because comedy does vary greatly around the world. There are obviously differences between British and American comedy. I mean, we don't do roasts in the UK in the same way as our American cousins would have. But I would say the humor isn't massively different, not as different as we think it is. Both countries use satire, both countries use dark humor. Um, Satire indeed has a long tradition in Anglo-Saxon culture, if I could put it that way. Um, but the question is there times that comedy can go too far? I would say the answer is definitely yes. And here's the thing, I really challenge the idea that comedy is untouchable, that it is the only medium that cannot be criticized somehow. So I find myself getting quite frustrated when I see people saying things like, oh, just have a sense of humor. There are certain things I think that just go too far. Now, speaking for myself, I I can appreciate satire. I can appreciate edgy humor. I really can. I don't consider myself puritanical, but there are certain things that I think go beyond being an approach of making commentary on something, and they just come down to being cruel and crude and tasteless for the sake of it. I'll give an example. We have a comedian in the UK, I think he's passed away now, Roy Chubby Brown. I've never had much time for him, but anyway, as a case in point, in 1985 there was a big disaster in Bradford, which is a city in northern England. The football stadium there, big fire, 56 people died. Not long after that, he told a joke in which he said, no one invited me to the barbecue. Now, this was after 56 people died in one of our worst ever sporting disasters. It didn't go down well and with good reason. You can understand that. Um, so, that sort of situation, joking about disaster, I can understand for instance, in, let's say, a terrorist attack, joking about the terrorists, mocking the terrorists. Is that sort of a little bit of fight back? It's having a go at the terrorists. But there's a big difference between that and mocking the victims in terms of jokes about terrorist attacks. Likewise, when jokes become so personalized that and the target of the jokes cannot defend themselves, I think again that's not clever. That's really, I see it as bullying. I mean, take for instance if you have a comedian standing up and cracking a joke about someone's severely disabled child. To me, that's beyond the pale. And it doesn't matter if they claim that they are attacking the child's parent. The point is to, when someone's in the public arena, whether they be a politician or a business person or whoever, if they're in a public arena, they know that a certain degree of scrutiny comes with that. But I take the view that their families are out of bounds. So if someone happens to be a politician, I know Sarah Palin had this issue a while back. I think it was Seth MacFarlane or someone like that made a joke at her daughter's expense. The point there is it's not aimed at the public figure. It's aimed at the person um, who it hasn't chosen to be a public figure, and I really, really do take issue with that. If I had some personal trauma in my family, let's say Or even a personal challenge. Let's say I had a severely disabled child and I saw some comedian trying to make light of that because they wanted to have a go at me. I would feel very pissed off because I feel it would be a cheap shot against my disabled child. Um, Likewise, and again, these are not things that have happened, but I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of some of the targets of these so-called comedians. I mean, let's say, for example, your partner had been murdered in a horrible crime. Let's say, I mean, God forbid it's a horrible thought, but let's say I had a wife or girlfriend and she was horribly murdered, raped. I'm not saying that lightly, but this is just the sort of jokes I'm talking about. And then some comedian made a joke about that. I would really want to pound his face in, to be quite honest. Um, so I think there is definitely a red line. Now I'm not calling for censorship, not at all, but I do really take issue with people who say, "Oh, just have a sense of humor." What you can't do is impose your humor onto other people and dictate that they have to find it funny. People do have a right to disagree. People do have a right to be offended. That's different from having a right to censor, which is a different matter, and that's a lot more complex. But you can't say, "Oh, don't be so sensitive," or "don't have a sense of humor," with that sort of humor. I do know that some people are too sensitive and some people are too politically correct. Well, I'm no fan of political correctness, and I agree that some people are too sensitive. But if you cannot see why mocking a disabled child or a major disaster that has caused a huge deal of pain and suffering, if you cannot see why cracking a joke about something like that would deeply offend and hurt people, then there's something wrong with you. And I do think that certain people who justify this sort of humor have a compassion deficit. I do believe there are people out there, the sort of people who find this funny, more often than not, are the sort of people who would engage in bullying, and I think that really speaks volumes. So let me know your thoughts. I mean, I want to be very clear here. I'm not telling anyone else what they should and shouldn't find funny, and I'm not calling for censorship. What I am saying, though, is that this idea that comedians cannot be criticized and that if you don't like humor, you have to just shut up about it, I think that's wrong. I think if you, for example, have been involved in a major disaster and then you hear a comedian cracking a joke about it, I think people have a right to be angry about that. You cannot tell people to imprison their emotions. I mean, if you really do think they're being too sensitive, okay, but I think my own opinion is that there are certain comedians out there who are basically just scumbags. They make their money off other people's suffering, and I think that's disgusting in the sense of trying to make cheap shots out of it. I really do think that's disgusting. That's why I've no time for the likes of Roy Chubby Brown, and there's others out there. I just don't see the appeal at all. I don't think he's even particularly smart. I mean, from what I've seen of him, he's just crude for the sake of it. He's just a shock jock. He doesn't. There's nothing particularly clever about his work. It's not even particularly witty. It doesn't take a lot of intelligence. The sort of jokes that he comes out with. It's just crude, and I really don't understand the sort of mentality of people who would find that funny. Now, again, it's not a case of telling other people what they shouldn't find funny, but I admit I do not understand it. Um, so yeah, so summed up, basically, what you can't do is just as people cannot censor comedy, by the same token, you cannot dictate to other people what they should and shouldn't find funny. So, someone does find something offensive. You know what? That's their right in a free society to find it offensive. I don't agree with those who say there's no right to be offended. I think people can be offended. It's human nature. And, like I say, if you have personally suffered something and some comedians using your suffering as the butt line of their joke, then yeah, um, I think it's a low blow. I think it's a cheap shot move. I think it's a cards move. And I think some comedians are cards. They're cards because they're using often targets who can't defend themselves, such as a disabled child. That's the actions of a card. And I think it's pretty despicable, to be quite honest. So let me know your thoughts. I appreciate not everyone will agree with this. That's fine. But I don't want to hear things like, oh, have a sense of humor. That's the most regurgitated piece of nonsense. I mean, really, you cannot. It's just like not everyone has the same taste in films or the same taste in food or the same taste in books. Likewise, not everyone has the same taste in comedy. So you can't say have a sense of humor. That doesn't mean anything because one person's sense of humor to someone else would be going too far. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.